it's clear that we're not through this painful part of our history. Those monuments are alive.
Hi, I'm Igor Volsky.
I'm Michelle Jawando, and welcome back to another episode of Thinking Cap. This week, we heard from New Orleans Mayor Mitch Landrieu on his, I think in some circles controversial, but I think for many others, well overdue decision to remove 4 Confederate monuments from public spaces in the city of New Orleans. And we also talked to New York Times bestseller, author, professor, historian Ibram Kendi about his new book, Stamped from the Beginning, which chronicles the history of racism and racist ideas in America.
I wonder why Ibram doesn't lead with the fact that he's Michelle Jowando's cousin in those bios. He starts
totally
with
should.
New York Times bestselling author.
I know.
Interesting choice.
He's missing a whole clause.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
No.
An important note.
That's right.
And the question we're asking this week is, have we progressed as Americans past the deep-seated racial problem that has dominated and in many ways has really written a lot of our history as a nation? We have just come out of the first African-American president who had a lot of trouble pushing his agenda forward, at least partly because he was African-American. And we've elected, as a country, a president who ran a campaign that overtly denigrated black people, said that they lived in ghettos and that here he was going to help them improve their lives. And, of course, who's pushing an agenda, let's just not get away from the substance of this, it's not just rhetoric, but pushing an agenda that would really negatively affect African-American communities and communities of color. Is there progress we can look to in places like New Orleans where a white Southern mayor is taking steps that we should be proud of?
You know, I think this conversation about progress is always wrapped in history and context, because as much as we think historically about advances, whether it's the Voting Rights Act or suffrage rights, it is both coupled and then accompanied with racist progress, right? So that's why you can have the election of a Barack Obama and then the very next election is Donald Trump. Here on Thinking Cap, we're sitting down with the New Orleans mayor, Mayor Mitch Landrieu, the 61st mayor of the city, who a few weeks ago, Mayor Landrieu, presided over the removal of 4 Confederate statues. And I will tell you, and I just want to just go right here and just jump right in, you are a white Southern mayor from a storied family in the Deep South. And I don't think in all of my life I've heard any white Southern man use the language that you use to describe why we had to do something about these Confederate statues with such passion, such integrity. And it kind of struck me that here I am, I'm a proud member of this party, but this was the first time I've ever heard someone articulate with such honesty why we need to remove the statues. How did you get there?
Oh, wow, that's a long story. But you know, I don't, first of all, I'm not the first person that's talked about this. Every mayor that's come before me has talked about this issue, so this isn't something that I conceptualized. Secondly, there are leaders across the South who have been very strong in the issue of racial reconciliation. My father was one of them. William Winter, who was the governor of Mississippi, was another. And Bill Clinton spoke a lot about this. My heroes, John Lewis and, Ralph Abernathy and Medgar Evers, all of those individuals I'm aware of because I grew up in the South, how I grew up, which is in a deeply rich multicultural environment. After Katrina destroyed New Orleans, we began to rebuild the city. And one of the most amazing things that the people of New Orleans did was to allow me to really push the city into a space of not putting the city back the way it was, to actually doing a deep dive on who we were, what our history was, and how if we were going to build the city back, we would put back in a condition that it should have been in had we gotten it right the first time. And so as we were reconstructing the city, those monuments stuck out like a sore thumb. My friend Wynton Marcella said to me, who I was asking to help curate the 300th anniversary, which is next year, man, you ought to take those monuments down. And I had never thought about the monuments. I pass by them every day. The most immediate thing that occurred to me is that those monuments are a lie. Not only about what the Civil War was about, but it was a lie that those monuments actually represented who New Orleans ever was. And so I said, well, that's kind of crazy. I mean, if we're rebuilding health clinics, rebuilding hospitals, rebuilding schools, why don't we curate our public spaces that should reflect all of our history? And by the way, our history is awesome. Mm-hmm. I mean, the history of New Orleans, and with our food and our music and our architecture, and the beauty of it that comes out of, well, but you see, here's the thing. The essence of who we are is diversity. That's who New Orleans is. If you come to New Orleans, you say, man, there's something jacked up about this city. This is a soulful place. It gets all up in you.
Without question.
You understand what I'm
I've
saying?
never been, by the way. Have you been?
Well,
I feel so
Don't
bad.
say
I feel so
that.
bad for you.
Oh, I know. I sure do,
But
Igor.
when you think about it, jazz is a manifestation of the coming together of different cultures across the ages to create a new form of music that's better than all of its parts.
That's right.
The food that we eat is an accumulation of that. So New Orleans, the one gift that we have given to the world, amongst others, is what indivisibility really looks like. And so when we began thinking about this got to be like, well, wait, those statues don't need to be there.
Right.
But it was when we started to move them that people said, oh, wait, not only no, but hell no, because those monuments represent something to us. And I just thought they weren't truthful. And I wanted to speak the truth. And I wanted the city of New Orleans to reflect our history, our diversity, and our authenticity. And so we just decided that it was the right thing to do.
So I was a baby voting rights lawyer. This is after Katrina, and we were trying to encourage folks to come back. So I remember being on the ground for about 2 months, working with voters, trying to get them back from Galveston, Texas, and others to come back and letting them know the city was open and ready for business. And there was something in your speech that I just want to share, because you talked about this kind of idea of, did everyone feel like this was their place? Did everyone feel like they could come back and really see themselves? So you said in your speech,
surely we are far enough removed from this dark time to acknowledge that the cause of the Confederacy was wrong.
and I wonder, because there were hundreds of, if you see the images from that day, there were hundreds of police officers and law enforcement. You had a kind of counter protest to the work you were doing. It does seem like not everybody agrees that the Confederacy was wrong.
I think that's fair. But I wouldn't overemphasize that. It's clear that we're not through this painful part of our history. But in New Orleans, for example, I was absolutely clear and convinced that the majority of people in New Orleans wanted those statues down, because after they began to know and to understand, and this is where there's hope, because people can be enlightened. I didn't decide this on my own. There were 5 public hearings. We had bunches of court decisions. I mean, the democratic process worked exactly the way it should, and the people of New Orleans had a right to do what it is that they said they did. The weird thing is that people who are not from New Orleans trying to tell us what to do with our property. I think that it's not a question anymore about why the Civil War was fought. The Civil War was fought to protect slavery. It was fought to deny people's humanity. And if that is true, and I believe it to be, then it seemed to me to be morally offensive to have people in my city, which is majority African American, walking by a piece of property that they own with an individual standing atop on it who's being honored for trying to deny their humanity. That's incongruous. That just doesn't make any sense. And so when people say, oh, you're trying to change history, I'm not trying to change history. I'm trying to correct history and right what was a wrong interpretation of history and put up a true message of history.
Mr. Mayor, let me contextualize the removal of the statues and your great speech in the political moment of today. We, of course, saw a presidential campaign that divided Americans along racial lines and did so in a very overt way. I think what you have done and what your city has done, I think, does give us a glimmer of hope that within all of this negativity, within the toxic rhetoric, there is opportunity for real unity and real hope.
And healing.
And healing, absolutely, yeah. What lessons can we learn from what your city has done? Is there something we can apply to our national conversation, our national politics?
You know, I've said many times, resurrection and redemption come from the most unlikely of places. I mean, who would have thought that so many years ago, New Orleans would be setting the pace for the rest of the nation on actually how you rebuild? I mean, we have rebuilt the entire city. We rebuilt our sewer systems, our clinics, our hospitals, our schools. We've also demonstrated a lot of forward progress on the issue of race. One of the things that we can't keep doing, and by the way, this happens in other cities outside of the South too, is continuing to live in a historical lie. I mean, one of the things we can all agree on is figuring out what the historical truth is, and then there's plenty enough to argue about after that. But I would just say this, that it's just hard. It takes a lot of hard work, and you have to listen to each other.
Right. So I think that's part of the challenge, right? How do you have that uncomfortable conversation?
You have
because once you begin and open the
how you have it, you have to have it.
Right.
And which now what's
who
the mechanism?
would facilitate that conversation?
Well, that's a
Yeah.
great question because we got when we started this, we didn't know what we were doing, so we went and said, well, who would do something like that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, William Winter, who was a white Democratic governor of Mississippi, started the William Winter Institute of Racial Reconciliation. Now, this is one of, I think, many, but I called him and said, look, I need to figure out how to do this. Have you been doing it? And he said, yeah, there's something we've designed called the Welcome Table. He said it's an open table that's small that you put in your community and you invite people to, and people who want to come, and they talk about the issues of race, and they get to know each other better. Now, we know that this works because all of us that have grown up in mixed neighborhoods that gotten to know each other and began to see each other as human beings and start to look out after each other or like confronted with the fact that we're just the same. But if you don't live in a neighborhood where another person who doesn't look like you lives, you can, or you go to a country club that doesn't let certain folks in, you can, convince yourself that somehow, you're not all the same. And we're the ones that there's a song,
Add the extra stuff.
there's a song from South Pacific that says you've got to be taught. Everybody should go listen to the song. You've got to be taught to hate and fear. You've got to be taught from year to year. It's got to be drummed in your dear little ear. You have to be carefully taught. And that is not about black versus white. That's about other folks. And we drum that into our children's ears. And we do it from the communities that we live in and how we live, who we hang out with, what we say in the home when we don't think anybody's listening. The kids are listening. The kids are listening. So it's got to be purposeful. And there has to be an action. If you don't like the welcome table, try something else. But just try something.
Try something.
Whatever you think works, you try it and create something. If you don't have something that works for you, but at least try it. But don't say that there's not a problem. There's a problem.
Mayor Mitch Landrieu, 61st mayor of New Orleans. Since 2010, New Orleans has been ranked as the #1 metropolitan area for overall economic recovery. And I will tell you firsthand, it is one of my favorite places to
Thank
go.
you.
Gotta
Well,
go.
you're
I'll
welcome.
be there for Essence pretty soon.
Emma.
So there you go.
I love Essence.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you,
Mr.
Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. And you need to bring him.
Yes, please do. Thank you, sir.
Bring him to Essence.
We're also glad that the Confederate statues have been brought down, but the ideas they represented are still very much with us today.
So we are now joined by Ibram X Kendi, New York Times bestselling author and award-winning historian at the University of Florida. In August, Kendi will be leaving the Sunshine State and heading to the center of gravity where a certain resident at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, I think, needs to pick up his book, where he'll become
Really highlighted, too.
highlighted with
Take some notes in the
footnotes
margins.
and Twitter subtitles. Well, he'll become professor of history and international relations and the founding director of Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center at American University. His New York Times bestselling book, Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, was the National Book Award winner. And we are so happy to have you here on Thinking Cap.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be on this new and exciting show.
You know, we just had Mayor Landrieu on the show. And Ibram, I can't wait to get your take on this. So, you may have heard his efforts last month to remove Confederate monuments from the city of New Orleans, and really highlighting kind of what that moment was. There was this speech that he put forth that received, international accolades for really confronting head on what the these symbols of the Confederacy, what they meant, and how they really were impeding the progress of New Orleans moving forward. So I just love kind of your take, what you thought that moment was, and what is this American occupation with the symbols of the old Confederacy?
Well, I mean, of course, I think like many people across the South and across the world, happy that some of these monuments and memorials are being taken down. And of course, New Orleans is becoming one of the flashpoints for that new development. But I think really what we've been engaged in as a country since the end of the Confederacy has been an argument over what the Confederacy represented, what the Confederacy intended to do. And those who have tried to make the case that the Confederacy is in their heritage, that the Confederacy was based on states' rights. Some of these people, if not many of these people, are in power. And in the South, I know not far from here, in where I live now in Gainesville, there's a state rep in Ocala who classifies himself as a descendant of a Confederate, and he champions his sort of defense of the Confederacy. And so you have these types of state reps across the South. And these people easily sort of ignore what the actual Confederate leaders said about slavery and what they said about Black people. And it's just amazing how they can do that. So, we mentioned my book, Stamped from the Beginning. It was taken from a quote from Jefferson Davis, who became the president of the Confederacy, who said on the floor of the U.S. Senate that the inequality between the white and Black races was stamped from the beginning. And if that's not a racist idea, I don't know what is.
This idea of a post-racial society was certainly, I think, everywhere after President Obama was elected. Well, now that we've elected the nation's first Black president, we have proven to everyone that we've risen above our racist history and have become these non-racists. But certainly that's not how his presidency played out. His presidency and his efforts to accomplish the goals he campaigned on encountered a lot of racist opposition. And I'm curious to hear your analysis of that, of how race played into the really unprecedented wall of opposition President Obama encountered in Congress, and then also how it may have led his very election to the rise of Donald Trump and to this ability now in American politics to very directly speak to white supremacists, and to do so as Trump did during his campaign unapologetically.
I'll answer the second one first. I think when we look at the history of race in this country, we see a situation in which when Black people, of course my work studies Black people, when Black people uplift themselves and sort of break through barriers, it does not result in a situation in which those who benefited from those barriers or those who felt better about themselves because Black people were barred off from particular opportunities, it doesn't result in a situation in which they go home. It results in a new energy on their part to create a new set of barriers and a new set of ideas to justify those new barriers. And so what I'm ultimately saying is that racial progress, as represented through the election of Obama, has typically brought on the progression of racism or racist progress. And so I think Trump's election coming on the back end of Obama is pretty indicative of American history. I mean, we like to think, and Black people, particularly middle-income Black people, have largely been taught that the way to undermine racism or the racist ideas of white people is by uplifting ourselves, by defying racial stereotypes, by showing our equality. But unfortunately, that has actually brought on the wrath of racism.
Can I just add, Joe Biden spoke to Terry Gross just maybe last week, and she asked him this very question: what role do you think racism played in stopping the Obama-Biden agenda? And he said there were moments during Obama's presidency where he would be in the Oval Office with the president, and he would be meeting with a congressional Republican in this particular example. And the way the congressional Republican was behaving towards the president in this very disrespectful way really angered Biden. And so when the meeting was over, Biden kind of lurched towards him and thought to himself, I'm really going to give him a piece of my mind. I want to tell him directly, as Biden would.
I love a good joke.
Yeah, that this kind of behavior is completely unacceptable.
Right.
But then Obama pulled him back and said, Joe, what are you doing? And Biden said, I'm going to tell him that he can't treat you like this, like he treated you completely inappropriately. And Obama said to him, you know, I've been facing that kind of thing all my life. And what I choose to do in those moments is just rise above it. And so I'm wondering, do you think then, given the history and given the fact that when you do see examples of kind of empowered and successful Black people, that doesn't lead to greater equality? Who's right in that moment? Was it Joe Biden in kind of giving him a piece of his mind in a real scolding, or was it Obama who said, let's just rise above this?
I think historically, Obama's decision has been correct, and I think many people would say, and I think Black people in particular would say, that is precisely one of the major reasons why they fell in love with Obama and the Obama family. Because no matter what sort of came at them, sort of in the form of racism, they sort of still had the ability to maintain their cool.
So, Philando Castile, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, Rakia Boyd, we say their names, but I think most recently we as an African American community are lurching from the latest news of another non-indictment of an officer and a police-involved killing. But what was unique about the Castile moment was it was brought to you live on Facebook. And so you heard the screaming and the crying and the agony of his 4-year-old, stepdaughter in the back seat, his fiancée next to him. And yet, in spite of that, not only did the jury find the officer not guilty of involuntary manslaughter, I believe was one of the charges, but then there wasn't even the negligence for shooting into a car with a 4-year-old and the fiance next to him. And that was, so poignant for me in that I have a 4-year-old. I cannot imagine a police officer shooting into the car with my 4-year-old crying in the background when the entire situation is completely subdued. And it reminds me of the power of the lynching tree and the communities celebrating the lynching and having the barbecue and the cookout around that incident, and letting communities, African American communities, see we can do this and nothing will happen to us. And this is a notice for you of our power and what we can do. How do we process and continue to process these moments?
Well, I think the way sort of you described it, and to a certain extent processed it, I think is certainly dead on. And I think at the end of the day, and when I say we, people who are interested in and serious about making sure this is the last name we say and eliminating racism in the criminal justice system, have to recognize that at its most basic level, this is a struggle over power. And I think that's sort of what you referenced in your sort of statement, that this really is at its basic level a power struggle. And those people who are committed and serious about creating a policing environment in which police officers first would not think to do this because they're going to be held accountable. And secondly, if they were to do that, they would be convicted. So then the question becomes, how do we go about creating that? Particularly when the policing forces in this country and their political defenders claim that police officers are the only professionals in our nation who are perfect.
So One question kind of connected to that is even just the use of the word racist, right? I think even as I'm in this conversation with you now, and even as you talk to politicians who are dealing with the issue of Confederate monuments and other issues, everyone is quick to say, "Well, I'm not racist," right? This happens, but no, that's not racism, and it's just even the power of that word. Where does that come from, and what is, or why do you think that we struggle with even using that word to describe actions that I think, according to your book, are inherently produced out of racist ideas, but why the struggle for so many?
So I think this allows us to have a sense of the function of racist ideas. And I think one of the things that I want to show and stand from the beginning is that function. And so I show that essentially every racist idea in history is like what we call now a post-racial idea. What it does is it causes people to not think that racial discrimination exists, and that's not the cause of racial inequities and disparities. Racist ideas cause people to look out at these disparities and inequities in society and say it's the result of Black inferiority. And so therefore that causes them to challenge or want to incarcerate or even civilize Black people, as opposed to challenging racial discrimination. And therefore those who benefit from racial discrimination or racist policies, they're allowed to continue to benefit because those policies continue. So basically the function of racism is for all of us to not admit our own racist ideas, and for us to not see racial discrimination. And I should also say very quickly that that there really is no such thing as non-racism. Or the concept of I'm not a racist. We either believe in racist ideas or we believe in anti-racist ideas. We either believe in racial hierarchy or we believe in racial equality.
We have been joined by Dr. Ibram Kendi, the New York Times bestselling author of Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, and the founding director of the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center at American University.
Thanks so much for joining us on Thinking Cap.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thinking Cap is produced by Sally Tucker, music by Kyle Epstein and Jacob Buchanan, graphics by Matt Ingram. For more, find us at Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, and at AmericanProgress.org, or wherever you want.